Hello, YouTube, and welcome back down here to the Gamer's Den with me, your host, Jordan, Master of Lore and Storyteller Extraordinaire. For today, we're going to be talking about, well, it's a continuation of what I brought up last Saturday with diversifying your villains, your antagonists, and mostly what I had covered was how you diversify them in terms of presenting them with their motivations and mindsets really doing a lot to dictate how they act in combat and non-combat situations. Again, my go-to example was rogues, people part of the Thieves Guild, are going to be more likely to flee a fight once it's turned against them. They're not going to stand there and throw their lives away. Their goal is to survive and, make coin, live to fight another day, and make money another day. Um, but on occasion, you do get your more die-hard believers, your paladins, clerics, people who just wholeheartedly will throw themselves into a cause and fight for it, even unto their dying breaths. So it's a really great way of diversifying your enemies and keeping things from getting a little bit too stale and keeping it all interesting overall. Again, a certain amount of this just depends on the kind of context that you got going with your story here. If you're dealing with, say, the high fantasy or even sci fi versions of whatever the Crusades may be, you're going to be running into more hardline, hardcore believers that are going to fight, kill, and die in the name of whatever cause they're fighting for. But for today, we're going to be talking about some of my most favorite enemies and monster types to use against my players, and that is outsiders, specifically demons and devils. Now, for those of you who don't know and maybe new to tabletop gaming and to the channel and just all of this overall, outsiders is just a term for creatures that do not exist or naturally occur on a mortal plane of existence. Um, think about our real world concepts, different religious concepts of heaven, hell, Valhalla, the abyss, Hades, all of those different things. Basically, the afterlives that a soul may depart to. The creatures that populate these various realms, you have your angels in heaven, devils down in hell, Valkyries from Valhalla. Those places, those creatures, those beings occur naturally in those realms. They're not natural creatures to these realms, and because of their supernatural origins, they tend to have abilities, physical, magical, and the like, that are far beyond the norm of what you'd find with us mortal creatures. In game terms, outsiders encompasses, well, a pretty broad range of things. Again, angels, demons, devils, inevitables. They're all based on different variations of alignments. Alignments being something that dictates a character, a being's general outlook on things. Now, when it comes to demons and devils, there's a great deal of difference between them. And I'll just give you a quick breakdown here. Devils are evil and they're lawfully oriented, meaning they believe in a rigid order, a rigid hierarchy that is to be absolutely maintained, especially for all of their lessers. But the rules don't quite always apply to them. That's for their lessers, and their lessers are supposed to obey the orders handed down to them by their betters from on high. Well, or in this case, from down below, further within the pits. Devils also occur on the seven layers of hell. There's seven different layers encompassing different aspects that you would find in hell, kind of based off of the Divine Comedy. Now, demons. Demons are from the infinite realms of the abyss. Infinite realms, some of these realms are limited in their scope and size, others are infinite into and of themselves, but are interconnected through different parts of the abyss, through different portals. And demons are chaotic evil. There is no rigid hierarchy or structure. There is just raw, seething emotion and hatred, bitter sadness, or rampaging wanton lust. These are demons. Demons come at you in vast hordes, bundles of white hot rage with fangs, teeth, and whatever weapons they can scrabble up into their claws. Devils will fight intelligently, organized, and with clever, insidious tactics and attack from multiple directions. And not all of them actually direct physical attacks or even magical attacks. Sometimes it's just a subtle bit of manipulation or extortion on people that the players rely on. Demons will play on people's emotions. They understand emotions. They tempt mortals with their raw desires and passions rather than luring them into contracts. But they will still tend to be a bit more forward and direct and a lot less subtle than, say, a devil would be. So these are the some of the most basic differences between the two of them. Now, why do I bring these guys up when it comes to portraying various different kinds of enemies for your players? Well, as we've covered with the differences right here, you have two very different types of enemies that you can throw at your players and make life all sorts of interesting and horrible for them. But there's also an added bonus when it comes to playing these kinds of outsiders, your demons or your devils. Um, on top of them being fundamentally, to the very core, the very essence and makeup of their beings, different from one another, to the point that they hate each other and have been trying to destroy each other from the start of existence. Um, they they because they are such ancient beings, whether it's demons or devils, because these are the types of creatures that have existed for so long, and to their very core, the very makeup of their being, they embody a, different particular aspects of evil. Their psychology, their mentality is going to be so vastly and fundamentally different from that of a mortal. Even their mortal servants. Mortal servants have, even in the service of whichever of these evils you decide to throw at your players, they are still mortal. They're still going to be flawed. They're still going to have doubts, even moments where maybe they end up being just a little bit kind in spite of the fact that they're trying to dedicate themselves to evil. Point being, mortals tend to be just a little bit more complex, while you can get away with your devils being a bit more simple. They go through complex plans and actions, but they are simplified overall in their mentality, being that their goal is the subversion and corruption of mortal souls to ensure that they go on to hell, to wipe out demon kind, and to invade the realms of heaven and bring about the annihilation of those places. Um, the motivation is relatively simple. The ultimate goal of the overall interconnecting network web of plans may be complicated, but the goal is simple. The mindset is simple. It's the how to get there that gets complicated when it comes to devils. And because these are beings with thousands of years of an existence, of a lifetime behind them, just on that principle alone, their thinking and mindset is going to be vastly different from that of a mortal. I mean, take a look in any of the popular literature that's out there. Tolkien, R.A. Salvatore. The way that elves are portrayed, because they live for many centuries, or in some cases a couple of millennia, their thought processes are so vastly different from that in comparison to a human that they are almost otherworldly and alien. They're still flesh and blood beings, though, so they're not too entirely dissimilar, but it's just the scope of their experiences and their perception of time that makes them so fundamentally different. Humans, at best, we get to live a century, maybe a little bit over. An elf, uh, for an elf, years and decades almost become a blink of an eye for them in the vast realms of their experiences. So, humans, because we have such short lives, even in the best of circumstances in comparison to all these different fantastic creatures, We have cultural memories that go on with various festivals and holidays and celebrating different historical events. Whereas in the case of, that's because we do those in order to remember those things, because otherwise those things might end up forgotten. And in some cases, those things will end up entirely forgotten as the society that built them or the culture that celebrates them collapses or is subsumed into another culture. Whereas with an elven culture wouldn't necessarily have as many festivals, feast days, and holidays, because in many cases, several of those elves were probably alive to experience those events, and for them, it's not just ancient history; it's a personal history for them. It's firsthand knowledge in their case. So right there, we see some pretty vast differences in just flesh and blood, mortal-ish creatures. Think about how much more that gets multiplied when you apply it to an outsider, whether it's a devil, demon, angel, an inevitable or an axiomite, um, any of these creatures, because they can potentially live a limitless amount of time and exist on planes of existence where time may flow in fundamentally different fashions from what you'd find in our mortal realms of existence. These creatures, just on that basis, are going to have mindsets that are fundamentally insane to a mortal creature. They're going to think about things in such a long-term fashion that it's almost impossible for a mortal mind to comprehend. And then again, we're adding in the fact that these beings, they're made up of a particular they're a physical manifestation of a particular concept, like take succubi, your seductors and temptresses. They are an embodiment of just raw lust and passions, whereas a pit fiend from the seven layers of hell is the physical and embodiment of just a brutal and rigid hierarchy of enforcing discipline and fear and indulging in that level of power. Um, these creatures are fundamentally going to think and operate in a vastly different way from mortals, to the point that when you're playing these creatures, you should try to portray them that way, that make them seem inscrutable or so wholly different in their thinking and functioning that when juxtaposed against mortal enemies, they stand out in such a big contrast. Uh, how do you do that? Well, demons and devils, their goals are wiping out mortal lives and making sure their souls end up getting consumed in one of their respective realms. So, mortal life to them is absolutely nothing. You might have a mortal warlord that's killed thousands, but that can potentially stick with a mortal mind. They may regret that or feel sad over that. They may have moments where they glory in their victory, but we tend to, mortal beings, us mortal creatures, tend to have very complex reactions to these sort of things. For a devil who's running a grand conspiracy and causes the deaths of tens of thousands of people, another day on the job. It's nothing for them. And really, how much detail you get into the evils of these various creatures is going to really be up to you and what your players are comfortable with portraying. Me and my friends, we tend to run some fairly mature games in some instances, and I I say like very loosely here. I will imply certain things, certain depravities, evils, and the like, rather than just outright tell them in vivid detail the awful things happening. But it's still implied there so that the players get an idea and feel of the level of evil that they're dealing with here. How it's a magnitude of order different from fighting just your run of the mill bandits. This is Bandits are motivated by coin, maybe a little bit of bloodshed and killing here and there. These creatures are just not about destroying a physical life. They're about corrupting the soul and inflicting as much damage so that it passes on through generations to try to ensure continual damnation like clockwork. So, just talk with your players first before you start going too far in one direction or another. But again, you should give the players a certain amount of feel when it comes to how just utterly awful and fundamentally different these kinds of creatures are and how different some of their mortal servants can be. Um, Again, a pit fiend causing the murder of tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people, or even the annihilation of an entire planet, that's just a good solid day's work right there. That's a bunch of misery and suffering that's ensured hundreds of thousands of souls have made their way down to the seven layers of hell. So, when it comes to these creatures, definitely make use of them. And also, when you're running a devil, if your if your characters are going up against a devil worshipping cult, and they're fighting some of these extraplanar beings from the seven layers of hell, be ruthless. That's what they do. That is absolutely what they do. If the players are making their way through a hideout that's well hidden, they're working their way through a building, going underground, well, they have to leave. If they had to travel to get there, they had to leave their horses, their pack animals, um, any friendly NPCs that might have stayed behind to watch the camp and tend to the animals while they're working their way through this fight. Well, many different uh, devil creatures have the ability to teleport around a bit. What's to stop them from teleporting out to the camp and slaughtering all the animals, killing their allies, and ruining all their provisions? Ensuring that, well, even if the player's characters are somehow successful in beating them, they've still taken some kind of a loss and may struggle to get out of the area there, especially if the base is hidden in some kind of a rough terrain. Now, that's not likely because, as I said, the goal is usually the corruption of souls. Being way out in the middle of rough terrain, it kind of limits the ability to gain access to said souls to be corrupted. But what again, it all boils down to a certain amount of context there. But again, devils are going to be ruthless. If they get beaten, they don't forget that thing. Remember what I said about for elves, different historical events aren't just a bit of history; they're a personal history. A devil creature will remember being beaten, whether it was directly beaten or one of its plots was just foiled and unraveled. Well, it's going to remember that, and it's going to learn as much as it can about the player's characters. It's going to use its spies and agents and whatever divinations it can conjure to learn about these players, what their strengths and weaknesses are, who their allies are, do they have family, who are their friends, what places do they frequent, how can they attack them, whether directly or indirectly, preferably indirectly, because if they can wipe out allies, take out friends, destroy or somehow ruin places they frequent. If the players have a castle, somehow finesse things over here with this nation so that the player's castle ends up under siege by mortal enemies and force them to flee or lose their territory. It isolates them, it weakens them, it puts them into a position where they're that much more vulnerable. They don't have as many safe places to go and rest and recuperate at. They're running out of friends, and really, if you're playing your NPCs right, all the other NPCs are going to start noticing, oh, dealing with these guys, it's a bad plan. Bad luck follows them, and it befalls everybody that interacts with them. Poor Joe, the Cooper over there, he worked with the players several times, providing them with barrels for all their foodstuffs at the castle. And he ended up being trampled to death by his horse or something. Some crazy, contrived, horrible, awful happenstance continually happens to everybody that helps the players. Nobody's going to be wanting to work with cursed people like that, if it's especially if it's going to be costing them their own lives. And if the players, if their characters have any families in game, those are fair targets for a devil and his minions. Those are things for them to go after. And it also makes, while it is an awful thing to do, it does make for a better story because the players are being challenged and tested. These characters are being driven in different ways. It makes it a fairly desperate story. And for the players to triumph and come out over top of that really is something special and unique right there. Especially if you're playing these types of NPCs ruthlessly, as you should be. Um, and now, when it comes to demons, as another example in comparison or juxtaposition, demons, they're not incapable of subtlety, but like I said before, they prefer to be much more direct. Uh, a pit fiend is perfectly fine with letting his minions do all the dirty work. After all, why should the pit fiend have to dirty his hands? But if the players do commit a grievous enough affront to their sensibilities or plans and have shamed them in some way, they'll be more than happy to go out there and collect their heads after they've inflicted as much misery on them as possible. Demons, while they will engage in that kind of subtlety, those little bits of temptation, they will just in general be a bit more direct, quite a bit more direct about it. They want to get that visceral feeling of their enemy's blood just oozing out from underneath their talons. They want to see that suffering up front and personal, and they want to be the ones inflicting it directly. It's hard for them to resist this, or at least that's my interpretation of them. It's fundamentally a part of their being to want that visceral feeling. Like I said, these are creatures of emotion. They're not creatures of this hard logical thinking like their devil counterparts are. These creatures want and feel that need. They feel that passion. They want that. They want that blood curdling violence, that abject terror. They want to see their enemies fleeing before them, and they want to chase them down and enjoy the thrill of the hunt and make that bloody, awful kill. So you play them that way. They go a bit more direct about it. Again, all the NPCs that may have dealt with or have seen the players in action see all this other stuff start happening. It's like, oh god, these horrible nightmarish creatures keep swarming them and hounding them. Anybody that's close by or ends up in their path just gets caught up in the maelstrom and just ends up dead. Nobody's going to want to be dealing with that. The characters are going to be cast out and driven from every town because they clearly have a black mark on their lives, and the demon is coming to collect. The demon is coming to inflict that pain and suffering, and they're going to do it as often as they possibly can. And again, it presents a different kind of challenge for the players. Myself, I've thrown both at my players at simultaneous times. A long running campaign I've had going for, gosh, just a little under a decade now, has seen a couple of different groups of players having to deal with two different cults. One a devil worshipping cult, the other a demon worshipping cult. One was worshipping Mammon, lord of the third layer of hell, devil lord of greed, and the other, the demon worshipping cult, worshipped Grost, demon lord of lust, one of the three demon princes of the infinite layers of the abyss. Very, very different creatures, very, very different cults, and it presented very different challenges for the players. But it got to the point that they were fairly paranoid because they didn't have many allies they could implicitly trust, and they would routinely check on them and also kind of keep an eye on them to make sure that things hadn't happened, that they hadn't been murdered and replaced by some sort of a shapeshifter that was hired or sent after them, or any number of different possibilities. It definitely was. Not only was it a very combat oriented campaign, but it was cloak and dagger, and I definitely tried to ramp up the paranoia of the players. It got to the point that they were terrified of fixtures and statues. They checked everything. And people, the NPCs noticed this behavior. They noticed these things and kind of got to be wary of dealing with these paranoid nut jobs that had all these awful creatures and things keep happening to them. Things got to be pretty dicey, especially for a long while there. Um, at least until they hit a certain point uh, where they could prove their reliability, and if you needed something awful dealt with, nobody else was going to deal with it. Well, you show up to this little mercenary company that the players started, and well, you had the right people to go demon hunting, devil slaying, and dealing with any other sorts of awful monstrosities. They had the expertise in dealing with these kinds of creatures. They're exactly the ones you wanted for the job. So, again, this just is a way to present unique and interesting challenges to your players. Understanding that these various creatures, have just fundamentally different mindsets and ways of looking at things can help you understand how to run them a bit differently, how to portray them a bit differently as you go over the course of your games and your campaigns. And we've only scratched the surface here. We haven't really talked a lot about angels, archons, various other creatures that might be good or neutral to different extents. Really, you just take what we've talked about here and flip it on its head for archons and angels, and you'll have basically the exact opposites. Angels tend to be on the lawful good spectrum. They also have a hierarchy and structure that they follow, but they're inherently good and benevolent beings. Now, given their nature, given their more sim- simplified view, yeah, simplified view is a good way of putting it. They tend to view things in a little bit more of a black and white sort of structure. Not that they aren't willing to forgive, but they certainly don't forget. And while they may be good creatures, they are not going to put up with seeing, well, if you have an evil necromancer that's running with the party, they're not going to be, if somehow the party's cleric decides to summon up an angel and the angel sees an evil necromancer with the party, it's going to have some questions, if not at least outright threaten or attack the necromancer and smite him for all of his sinful ways. It all just boils back down to presenting different types of enemies and obstacles and understanding how to portray them in these various different fashions to keep things just fresh and unique when you run these games for your players. And it's awesome to see everything come to fruition. Your friends laugh, the players enjoy the story and make their way through the campaign. Even those moments were like, oh God, not this again. Oh my God, not these awful things. Time to dive our hands back down into the muck and see what we can salvage out of this. The number of times my players just went, oh God, no, was absolutely fantastic and warmed my cold, awful, brutal heart. Anyways, ladies and gentlemen, I have been Jordan, your host, Master of Lore and Storyteller Extraordinaire. Please, if you like this video, hit the like and subscribe button. Also, make sure you click that bell icon over there so that way you get notified anytime a new video goes live here. You all have yourselves a good night.